First of all, it's good to see you. As I say, some familiar faces and some newcomers, which is great. So I'm Lisa Martin. I'm the Director of Complex Care Group. I'm also President of the Federation of Disability Information Centres. And as Carol was saying at the beginning, this piece of work is part of a contract between Whaikaha and a collaboration of the Federation of Disability Information Centres and Complex Care Group. So there's two parts to that piece of work. Some of it is about facilitation, a sort of a pathfinder, walk alongside type of support being delivered through 6 of our member centres up and down the country. And the other part of these workshops. So we're required to deliver 1 per month for 6 months. And we thought that the best place to start is enabling good lives, because all of the other topics are going to flow from there. So that's why today we're talking about enabling good lives. So welcome everybody. What I'll just ask you to do is to keep your microphone muted for now. And then what we're going to do is the first half of this workshop, which we've allowed 1.5 hours. So the first 45 minutes, thereabouts, will be me doing a bit of a presentation. I've got a PowerPoint presentation. And then I'm going to stop recording. And that's when we'll all have an opportunity to have a conversation. And speak freely, because as Carol mentioned, there are no provider organisations here on the Zoom, and it's an opportunity to talk really openly about enabling good lives and what are the benefits of that, what do we see potentially as the challenges, the principles and how they relate to us, etc. So, all right. So as I say, we've allowed about 1.5 hours, but we'll be approximate about that. I'm going to screen share again, and we'll get started. Okay. So hopefully you can now see this PowerPoint that I've put together, Enabling Good Lives, and we will start. So what we're going to do is, yes. There we go. So as I said, the first half of the meeting is me doing a bit of a presentation. We'll save the questions until the end, because then once we've switched off the camera, we can really have a robust conversation. So the second half is that conversational part. All right. Now, what I've done here is I've delved a little bit into the history of the New Zealand disability sector, and I'm going to try not to agonise too much over the detail here, but I do think it's important in terms of a sense of perspective around how we've come to be where we are and potentially the way forward. So just a few bullet points here. New Zealand, as we know, was colonised by Europeans 2 centuries ago, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed in 1840, an agreement between the Crown and Indigenous Maori of New Zealand. Now, as we know, the colonialists and the Maori had a different worldview of disability, and the Maori approach is more embedded in diversity, the diversity of the individual and the whānau, the family, and you know, the wider family group. So the colonialists perceived that disabled people might not be able to work hard to build a new society in New Zealand, and they perceived disability as impeding that potentially. So they passed the 1882 Imbecile Passengers Act. Now, as you know, some of these terms are pretty confronting, actually, and highly offensive by today's standards. And you wouldn't hear that terminology used today. But I do, as I say, I think it's important in terms of a sense of perspective of where we've come from. So, and this Imbecile Passengers Act restricted cripples, idiots, lunatics, infirm, blind, deaf, and dumb. Incredibly offensive. And then the Immigration Restriction Act banned the idiotic and the insane and contagious people. So mental illness was equally misunderstood in those times, and the first lunatic, I put that in inverted columns, the first lunatic asylum opened in Karori, New Zealand in 1854. So during the 19th century, some disabled people, such as deaf or blind people, were considered what they called habitable. meaning that they might be able to sort of contribute constructively to society in that old world view. The establishment of residential schools such as the Sumner Institute for the Deaf and Dumb, later called the Van Ash School, and in 1880 the Jubilee Institute for the Blind in Auckland in 1890. So the deaf and blind communities were able to develop their own culture to an extent. Sign language very slowly begins to evolve. And there were social Darwinists who wanted to prevent the growth of disabled populations. Sterilisation, for example, came to the fore. The eugenics movement was happening at this time, and a linking of disability to a sort of a moral degeneracy. Now, as I say, this is actually really confronting stuff, but this is just to paint a picture of how things looked in New Zealand in the 1800s. And into the 1900s, there was the 1914 Education Act, which required parents and teachers and police to report mentally defective children to the Department of Education. And the school medical service was formed to identify defective children so that they could be subject to a form of surveillance. And health camps were developed, often on farms and rural areas. Health camps were developed to temporarily remove children from their families and instill the ideals of health and fitness. And the new science of IQ testing was emerging at this time and was used as a classification tool for intellectual disability. So in 1908, the first New Zealand residential special school opened, Campbell Park School, and that was near Oamaru, for feeble-minded boys, and again, in inverted commas, highly offensive terms by today's standards. A few years later, a residential school for feeble-minded girls, Salisbury School, was opened in Richmond near Nelson. So in 1928, the Mental Defectives Amendment Act, establishment of the first New Zealand Psychopedic Institution, which was Templeton Farm Mental Deficiency Colony, near Christchurch in 1929. So we're now into the 1900s. There was a proliferation and an increase in size of the psychopedic institutions in the early 20th century. And as we know from history, disabled children were oftentimes placed in these psychopedic institutions. Families were encouraged in many circumstances to place their child there. It was a case of, we'll look after your child, we will do the best for them and care for them, and you go and continue on with your life, was the broad approach used at this time. And there's a picture there, that is a picture of the Campbell Park School in Oamaru. So just in terms of how enabling good lives did evolve, there was concern about treatment in psychopedic institutions from the 1940s onwards. And in 1973, there was the Royal Commission on psychopedic institutions recommending a transference from large institutions into community care. So this was the very early stages of community inclusion. So, and this paralleled a human rights based approach right throughout the Western world. So New Zealand was adopting that human rights-based approach to disability as well. And the concept of community inclusion was emerging quite strongly at this point. So rights-based approach to disability in New Zealand, most of the Western world from the 1970s through the 2000s and beyond, and the emergence of a switch from the medical model of disability to the social model of disability. Now, we know the medical model of disability paints the picture that it's the person who has the disability. It's something that needs to be fixed. They need to be fixed, and that's a very typical medicalized type of approach, treatment type of approach. The social model of disability perceives that actually it's the environment that is disabling. The disabled person isn't to be fixed. They are who they are, and there is great diversity in the population, as we know, but it's the environment in the community that can be disabling in many different respects, not only physically disabling by preventing by preventing access, but other forms of information provision and so forth was not necessarily accessible. So moving on, there was deinstitutionalisation begins in New Zealand in the 1970s, supports emerging in the community, and the growth of the service provider organisations who were contracted by government often to provide support in the community, and a growth of some day specialist schools as well. Instead of perhaps the more residential style specialist schools, there was the emergence of some day specialist schools. So in 2008, there was a select committee inquiry into the quality of care and service provision for people with disabilities. That was in response to some concerns about mistreatment and abuse in these institutions, in these environments. And so the results of that select committee inquiry landed at the desk of the then Minister for Disability Issues, Tariana Turia, and she, in order to address this, called together a working group to address the concerns that were in the select committee inquiry. So the working group came together and they were asked to go away and take a clean sheet approach to disability and report back. They were required to focus on day programs. That was the original focus of the Enabling Good Lives working group. And so they did come back with a report. It was called the Enabling Good Lives Day Options Report. And it was released in 2011. I've included a link there to that report. And it very much focused on a facilitation-based approach model for everyday life in everyday places. And that involves self-directed planning and facilitation, cross-government, individualised funding, portable funding, strengthening families and whānau, and community building. There was progressive deinstitutionalisation, which continued and resulted in the closure of New Zealand's last such facility, which was Kimberley in 2006, which feels remarkably recent. So New Zealand then signed the United Nations Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities in March 2007. And as we know, Sir Robert Martin was very involved in that. Sir Robert Martin is a man who was previously institutionalised and has led a very valuable piece of work in terms of having the issues recognised and the abuses recognised and deinstitutionalisation progressed. And the establishment of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we can certainly thank Sir Robert Martin there. And that was ratified by the New Zealand government in 2008. So when we move on to Enabling Good Lives, sort of more the here and now scenario, in 2012, the Ministerial Committee on Disability Issues endorses a whole of government change of direction of disability support to encompass the Enabling Good Lives approach. So over 2013 and 2014, over 2013 and 2014, the Enabling Good Lives demonstrations began in two areas in New Zealand, in Christchurch, and this was just post the Christchurch earthquakes. So it was decided that because of the destruction of the earthquakes and the many of the vocational day program premises had been damaged or did not exist, it was perceived that it might be a good opportunity to look at introducing the Enabling Good Lives approach in Christchurch. And that particular demonstration had a focus on post-schooling life for ORS funded students. ORS, that stands for Ongoing Resourcing Scheme funded students. That's a funding mechanism in the education sector for students with high needs or with very high needs. So it's funded at 2 separate levels. So the Christchurch demonstration focused on students who had AWS funding and were leaving school and looking at perhaps doing things a little bit differently or having the opportunity to make different choices rather than necessarily going to a vocational day program. They might choose other activities over the course of a week and have more choice and control in their daily life. And there was a Waikato demonstration as well, and this was really where the emergence of the concept of a facilitator came from, or a sort of a navigator, if you like, or a life coach type of approach, and that was called local area coordination, a sort of a walk alongside guide the disabled person in the choices assisting them with the choices that they might like to live their own good life, and how to access the support, mainstream support or specialist support that might be required to live their good life. So, and then there was the emergence of mana whaikaha, which was an approach in Mid-Central District Health Board region, which is, of course, the Palmerston North area of New Zealand, and that began on the 1st of October 2018. Very much taking a try, learn and adjust approach, a sort of a live, dynamic, ongoing adjustment of their approach as it is fine-tuned over time. And I've put their vision there. In the future, disabled people and their whānau will have greater choice and control over their lives and supports to make more use of natural and universally available support. And there's some links there too. A lot of information actually on the Enabling Good Lives website. I recommend going there. There's a wealth of information on there, and the mana whaikaha site as well. So then moving forward in time even further, and there was a cabinet paper in October 2021, which was called Disability System Transformation, Establishing a Ministry for Disabled People and National Implementation of the Enabling Good Lives approach. There's a link there to the cabinet paper if you're into reading that type of thing. I've read it. But in a nutshell, the government agrees to the implementation of the Enabling Good Lives approach nationally in New Zealand, and government agrees to establish a ministry for disabled people by the 1st of July, or to go live on the 1st of July 2022. And we know that that's happened. It's a departmental agency under the Ministry of Social Development and has responsibility for disability support services. And previously, disability support services was held at the Ministry of Health Disability Directorate. And of course, the transformation of disability support services in line with the Enabling Good Lives approach. So the cabinet paper, I've quoted from it there briefly because I thought that summed up some important points. A commitment to ensuring the system gives full effect to the voice of disabled people, families and whānau, and to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and is consistent with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and is also consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that it aligns with the principles and approaches of whānau ora, and it's about strengthening disability rights approaches across government strategies, including the Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy, Better Later Life, He Oranga Kaumātua, New Zealand Disability Strategy, and Mahi Aroha, the New Zealand Carers Strategy. So you can see there's a whole lot of different strategy and policy guidance there in terms of developing that approach in New Zealand to encompass the Enabling Good Lives approach. So the CEO, Paula Tesario, was appointed for 5 years on the 1st of September 2022. And here we are now. We're Enabling Good Lives in 2023. Well, the Whaikaha Ministry of Disabled People, they state on their website that they're guided by Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Principles of Enabling Good Lives, and whānau ora. So very useful to check out the Whaikaha website there. Also, what might be of interest is that as New Zealand is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, there is a reporting back process, a sort of a to and fro reporting back process, really, where New Zealand is required to report on our progress of implementing the various articles of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And then the United Nations look at that and come back with advice around what we could do better, what we've been a bit slow at doing, what we need to speed up doing, and generally commenting on our progress. So they're called the Concluding Observations, and they were recently released in September last year. So certainly have a read of that document if you enjoy reading that type of thing. It's about 15 pages long, but it's very, very interesting in terms of the recommendations for New Zealand in order to meet our obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I've listed the Enabling Good Lives principles there. I'm certain that we will all be quite familiar with them, and this was taken from the Enabling Good Lives website, as I must say some other content for my PowerPoint presentation was some aspects of it were copied from that Enabling Good Lives website. So I highly recommend going there. But it's useful to go through these, I think, because this is where we're at. These are the Enabling Good Lives principles now. Self-determination. Disabled people are in control of their own lives, beginning early, investing in families and whānau to support them and be aspirational for the disabled child, build community and natural supports, children to become independent rather than waiting for a crisis before support is available. Person-centered, and disabled people have supports that are tailored to their individual needs and take a whole-of-life approach. Ordinary life outcomes, and this is where the term everyday life and everyday places comes from, which sums it up quite nicely, actually. It should be about community inclusion. People are regarded as citizens with opportunities for employment, having a home and family, social participation, just like anybody else at a similar stage of life. Mainstream first. Disabled people are supported to access mainstream services first before the specialist disability support services. Mana enhancing, and the abilities and contributions of disabled people are recognised. Easy to use. We all like easy to use. People have supports that are simple and flexible. And relationship building. So supports build and strengthen relationships between disabled people, their whānau, and the community. So that kind of, that's a very nutshell view of enabling good lives. A little bit of information there about the history of enabling good lives, which I think is important. I've just stopped screen sharing there, as you can see. I think it is important to have that sense of perspective, confronting though it is, because goodness, when I was putting together that presentation, some of that terminology, from the 1800s is shocking, actually, by today's standards. But it's important to have that sense of perspective, and that was the terminology of the day, the attitudes of the day. But we've come a long way. So there you go. There's some important information in there, I think, which paints the picture of the history, how we came to be where we currently are, and the emerging future of enabling good lives. So really, really keen to have a little bit of a discussion now, which I think we might stop the recording at this point. What are we, 12:30? So that was a 30-minute sort of a presentation, so didn't take as long as I anticipated there. But you can see as well in that presentation the emergence of concepts around personalised budgets, individualised funding mentioned there, and shifting the locus of control from provider organisations, for example, needs assessment, service coordination organisations, and putting that natural authority back into the hands of disabled people and their family whānau. So, all right, I'm going to stop recording at this point.